My name is Sofia Garcia. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how I was betrayed by the people who were supposed to love me most. When my beautiful 8-year-old son Michael passed away from leukemia, I thought nothing could hurt more than losing him. I was wrong. The day of his funeral, as I sat in that cold funeral home surrounded by friends and neighbors, I realized something that shattered my heart all over again. My own parents, Robert and Linda, were nowhere to be found. But you won't believe what they had the audacity to ask me just 3 months later. If you've ever felt abandoned by family when you needed them most, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support means everything to me, and I know many of you understand this pain. Have you ever been in a situation where the people closest to you became strangers overnight? Because that's exactly what happened to me, and I want to share this story so others don't feel alone in their darkest moments. The betrayal I'm about to tell you about goes deeper than missing a funeral. It's about how greed can turn family into enemies, and how some people can look past a child's death to see only dollar signs. Michael had been fighting cancer for 2 years, and during that time, my parents visited maybe twice. They always had excuses. Work was busy, they couldn't handle seeing him sick, or they were dealing with their own problems. I made excuses for them because I wanted to believe they cared, even when their actions showed otherwise. When Michael's condition worsened, I called them every day, begging them to come see their grandson one last time. They promised they would come soon, but soon never came, and Michael passed away on a Tuesday morning with just me and my husband David by his side. The funeral was small but filled with love from people who truly cared about Michael. His teachers came, his little friends from school with their parents, our neighbors, and even people from the hospital who had grown to love him during his treatments. But as I looked around that room, searching for familiar faces that should have been there, the empty chairs where my parents should have been sitting felt like a physical weight on my chest. I kept checking my phone, thinking maybe they were just running late, maybe their flight was delayed. But deep down, I knew they weren't coming, and that realization was almost as painful as losing Michael himself. What happened next will shock you, and it's the reason I'm sharing this story today. Because sometimes the people we think we know best are capable of things we never imagined. 3 months after burying my son, when I was still struggling to get out of bed most mornings, I received a phone call that would change everything. My mother Linda called me, not to ask how I was coping or to apologize for missing the funeral, but to ask about Michael's trust fund. That $400,000 trust fund that my late grandmother had set up for Michael's future, a future that cancer had stolen from him. The conversation with my mother that day revealed a side of my family I had never seen before, and it introduced me to a type of betrayal I didn't know existed. When someone you love dies, especially a child, you expect the world to stop. You expect people to understand the gravity of what you've lost. You expect family to rally around you, to support you, to help you navigate through the darkest period of your life. But what I learned is that some people see tragedy as an opportunity, and some people can look at a grieving mother and see only what they can gain from her pain. This isn't just a story about missing a funeral. This is about how grief can reveal the true character of the people around you. The theme of this story goes beyond family drama or even betrayal. It's about the moment when you realize that the people who raised you, who you thought you knew completely, are capable of prioritizing money over your pain. It's about discovering that unconditional love might not be as unconditional as you believed. When I think back to that phone call, I remember feeling like I was in a nightmare, like I was talking to strangers who happened to sound like my parents. The tone in my mother's voice wasn't the tone of a grandmother mourning her grandson. It was the tone of someone making a business inquiry. Michael had always been the light of our family gatherings, the one who brought everyone together with his infectious laugh and boundless energy. Even when he was sick, he would ask about Grandma and Grandpa, wondering why they didn't visit anymore. I would make up stories to protect him, telling him they were busy or sick themselves, because I couldn't bear to let him know that his own grandparents had essentially abandoned him during his fight for life. Looking back now, I realize I was protecting the wrong people. I should have been honest with Michael about who really loved him, instead of covering for people who clearly didn't deserve his pure, unconditional love. The emotional weight of losing a child is something I wouldn't wish on anyone, but losing family support during that loss creates a different kind of pain entirely. It's the kind of betrayal that makes you question everything you thought you knew about love, family, and human decency. When Michael was alive, my parents would occasionally ask about his college fund, joking about how they hoped some of it might help with their retirement someday. I thought these were harmless jokes from grandparents who were proud of their grandson's bright future. I never imagined these casual comments were actually them, calculating and planning for a day when Michael might not be around to use that money himself. As I sat in my living room that day, listening to my mother explain why they thought they deserved Michael's trust fund for a family vacation to Europe, I felt something inside me break that hadn't broken, even when I lost my son. It was the last remaining piece of faith I had in family bonds, in the idea that blood relations meant something special and sacred. But that's when I realized something that would eventually save me from drowning in this betrayal. Sometimes the family that matters most isn't the one you're born into. It's the one you choose, and the one that chooses you back. The real question wasn't why my parents could be so heartless, but how I was going to rebuild my life, knowing that the people who should have been my foundation were actually quicksand. The morning of Michael's funeral, I woke up hoping it was all just a terrible nightmare. I remember looking at his empty bed across the hall and feeling like someone had ripped my heart right out of my chest. The funeral home felt so cold and sterile, nothing like the warm, vibrant child who used to fill our house with laughter and endless questions about everything. As people started arriving, I kept scanning the entrance, desperately hoping to see my parents walk through those doors. Every time someone new entered, my heart would skip a beat, thinking maybe this time it would be them, but they never came, and with each passing minute, the reality of their absence became more and more crushing. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of condolences from people who barely knew Michael, while the two people who should have been there to hold me up had chosen to stay away. The funeral director kept asking if we should wait a few more minutes for immediate family, and I had to keep saying no, knowing that the immediate family who mattered most to me had made their choice. David held my hand so tightly during the service, trying to be strong for both of us, but I could see the anger in his eyes every time he looked at those empty seats. The pain of losing Michael was unbearable, but the pain of facing that loss without my parents felt like a second death. During the eulogy, I talked about Michael's dreams of becoming an astronaut, his love for building Lego spaceships, and how he never complained even during his worst days of treatment. I shared stories about his kindness, like how he would save half his Halloween candy to give to kids at the hospital who couldn't go trick-or-treating. As I spoke those words, looking out at faces filled with genuine love and tears for my son, the absence of my parents became even more glaring. These strangers and acquaintances showed more respect for Michael's memory than his own grandparents. It was in that moment that I realized something had fundamentally broken in my family, something that might never be repaired. The burial was even harder, because it felt so final, so permanent. Watching them lower that small casket into the ground while knowing my parents were somewhere else, living their normal lives, felt like the ultimate betrayal. I remember thinking about all the times Michael had asked why Grandma and Grandpa didn't visit him in the hospital, and how I had made excuses for them, protecting their image in his innocent mind. Now, standing at his graveside, I realized I had been protecting people who didn't deserve protection, while my son died believing his grandparents loved him when their actions proved otherwise. But what came next would prove that missing the funeral was just the beginning of their heartless behavior. As we drove home from the cemetery, I never could have imagined that in just a few months, I would receive a phone call that would make their absence at the funeral seem like a small hurt compared to what was coming. The grief was already consuming every part of my life, but I was about to learn that some people see grief as weakness, and weakness as opportunity. You won't believe what they had the nerve to ask me, and how they justified their request with words that still haunt me today. For 3 months after Michael's funeral, my parents maintained a silence so complete it felt intentional and cruel. No phone calls to check how I was coping. No text messages asking if I needed anything. No acknowledgement that they had missed their own grandson's funeral. The silence was deafening, and spoke louder than any argument or confrontation ever could. I found myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for some sign that they realized what they had done, some indication that they felt even a tiny bit of remorse for abandoning me in my darkest hour. But there was nothing, just an empty void where their support should have been. If you've ever experienced the silent treatment from family members, please give this video a like and subscribe, because you'll understand how devastating it can be when the people who should love you most choose silence over compassion. Have you ever been ignored by family when you needed them most? Because that silence can hurt more than any harsh words they could have spoken. Their absence from Michael's life during his illness was already painful, but their complete silence after his death felt like they were erasing him from existence entirely. It was as if Michael had never mattered to them at all, and now that he was gone, there was no reason to maintain any connection with me or David. During those 3 months, I went through all the stages of grief, but I was also grieving the loss of my parents in a different way. I kept making excuses for them in my mind. Maybe they were too ashamed to reach out. Maybe they didn't know what to say. Maybe they were dealing with their own grief privately. I convinced myself that surely they were struggling with guilt and would eventually apologize, eventually explain why they had chosen not to come to their grandson's funeral. David would get angry every time I defended them, telling me I needed to stop protecting people who clearly didn't care about our pain. But I wasn't ready to accept that my own parents could be so cold and calculating. The psychological impact of their silence was almost worse than dealing with Michael's death itself. At least with Michael's death, I could understand it. Cancer is a disease. It's not personal. It's not a choice someone makes to hurt you. But my parents' silence was a deliberate choice, a conscious decision to abandon their daughter during the worst period of her life. I started questioning everything about my childhood, wondering if their love had always been conditional, wondering what kind of people could turn their backs on their own family during a tragedy. The silence made me feel invisible, like my pain didn't matter enough to even warrant acknowledgement. But then, on a Tuesday morning exactly 3 months and 2 days after Michael's funeral, my phone rang, and I saw my mother's name on the caller ID. My heart started racing because I thought maybe this was finally the call I had been waiting for, the apology, the explanation, the recognition of what they had put me through. I answered with hope in my voice, ready to forgive them if they just showed some sign of humanity and remorse. But what came out of my mother's mouth in those first few minutes would shatter any remaining faith I had in my family and show me just how deep their betrayal really went. What they asked for will shock you, and their reasoning behind it will make you question how well we really know the people closest to us. When I answered that phone call from my mother Linda, I was expecting an apology, maybe an explanation for their absence, or at least some acknowledgement of what our family had been through. Instead, after a brief hello, and asking how I was doing in the most casual way possible, she launched into what can only be described as the most shocking request I've ever received. "Sophia," she said, "we've been thinking about Michael's trust fund, and we were wondering if there might be a way to access some of that money now that he's gone." I actually had to ask her to repeat herself, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman who couldn't be bothered to attend her grandson's funeral was now calling to discuss his inheritance. My first reaction was complete disbelief, followed by a rage so intense I could barely speak. Here I was, still crying myself to sleep every night, still unable to go into Michael's room without breaking down, and my mother was treating his death like some kind of financial opportunity. She explained that since Michael was no longer here to use the money for college, they thought it would be practical to put it to good use for the family. I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, trying to process how someone could be so callous, so completely disconnected from basic human decency. This was the same woman who used to tell me that family always comes first, that blood is thicker than water. The trust fund had been set up by my late grandmother, Michael's great-grandmother, who had specifically wanted to ensure her great-grandson would have money for his education and future. She had worked 2 jobs her entire life to save that money, dreaming about the day Michael would graduate from college and maybe even pursue advanced degrees. When she passed away 5 years ago, she made it clear in her will that this money was for Michael's future, and only for Michael. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents, who had shown so little interest in Michael while he was alive, were now very interested in the money that was meant to secure his future. During that phone conversation, I tried to explain to my mother that the trust fund wasn't just money. It was my grandmother's love for Michael. It was hope for a future that cancer had stolen. It was all that remained of dreams that would never come true. But she didn't seem to understand the emotional significance of what she was asking for. She kept talking about it in purely practical terms, as if Michael's death had simply freed up some unused resources that the family could now enjoy. The disconnect between her casual tone and the magnitude of what she was suggesting made me realize that I was talking to someone who genuinely didn't understand the difference between losing a family member and losing an investment. What made the conversation even more surreal was how she presented their request, as if they were doing me a favor, as if accessing Michael's trust fund would somehow help me move on and stop dwelling on the past. She suggested that seeing the money put to good use would bring me comfort, that it would honor Michael's memory in a positive way. I couldn't understand how someone could be so completely blind to the pain they were causing, how they could think that spending their dead grandson's college fund would somehow heal their daughter's broken heart. But I was about to learn that their reasoning behind wanting the money would be even more shocking than the request itself, and it would forever change how I saw my parents as human beings. As the phone conversation continued, I asked my mother what exactly they planned to do with Michael's money if they could access it. I was hoping, praying, that maybe they had something meaningful in mind, perhaps a scholarship in his name, or a donation to the children's hospital where he had spent so much time. Maybe they wanted to fund cancer research, or help other families going through what we had endured. But when Linda finally revealed their true intentions, I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach and knocked all the air out of my lungs. "Well," she said, almost cheerfully, "your father and I have been talking about taking a family trip to Europe. You know, something to bring everyone together and help us all heal. A family vacation." They wanted to use my dead son's college fund for a family vacation to Europe. The same family that couldn't be bothered to attend his funeral now wanted to bond over a luxury trip, funded by his inheritance. The sheer superficiality of their request was so overwhelming that I actually laughed, not because anything was funny, but because my brain couldn't process such a level of insensitivity any other way. They were talking about healing and bringing the family together, while simultaneously showing complete disregard for the family member they had already abandoned. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. What made their request even more insulting was how they tried to frame it as something that would benefit everyone, including me and David. They painted this picture of a big family reunion trip, where we could all make new memories and celebrate life instead of dwelling on death. They talked about visiting beautiful places, trying new foods, and taking photos that would help us remember the good times instead of focusing on the sad ones. It was as if they believed that a European vacation could somehow erase the trauma of losing Michael and replace it with Instagram-worthy moments of family togetherness. The disconnect from reality was so complete that I began to wonder if I had ever really known these people at all. The most heartbreaking part of their request was how it revealed their complete inability to understand what Michael had meant to me and David. To them, his trust fund was just money sitting in an account, unused and available. They couldn't comprehend that every dollar in that account represented hopes, dreams, and a future that had been stolen by cancer. They didn't understand that touching that money would feel like betraying not just Michael, but also my grandmother, who had worked so hard to provide for his future. In their minds, Michael was gone, so the money should be put to practical use, rather than sitting there doing nothing. As I listened to my mother describe their planned itinerary, the hotels they wanted to book, the restaurants they wanted to try, the tours they wanted to take, I realized that this wasn't just about money, or even about selfishness. This was about two people who were so emotionally shallow that they could look at their daughter's greatest loss and see only an opportunity for their own pleasure. They weren't grieving their grandson. They weren't concerned about their daughter's pain. They weren't even ashamed of missing his funeral. They were focused entirely on how they could benefit from the situation, and they genuinely believed that a vacation would somehow make everything better. But their superficial solution to our family's deepest wound was about to reveal something about their character that would change everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. After that devastating phone call, I spent days trying to make sense of what had just happened, wrestling with questions that kept me awake at night. Was this deliberate betrayal, or were my parents just completely incapable of understanding the depth of what I was going through? Part of me wanted to believe that maybe they were just emotionally stunted, that maybe they had never learned how to process grief or show support during difficult times. I kept thinking about their own childhoods, wondering if they had been raised by people who were equally cold and disconnected, and whether their behavior was learned, rather than intentionally cruel. But then I would remember the calculated way my mother had brought up the trust fund, and I knew this went deeper than simple emotional immaturity. If you've ever been torn between making excuses for family members and accepting their true nature, please subscribe and hit that like button, because this internal struggle is something many of us face. Have you ever found yourself defending people who clearly don't deserve your loyalty? Because that's exactly where I was. Caught between the daughter who still wanted to believe her parents loved her, and the mother who could see their actions for what they really were. This wasn't just about missing a funeral or asking for money. This was about a fundamental difference in values, in basic human compassion, in what it means to be family. I was struggling to understand how the people who raised me could become such strangers to everything I thought they had taught me about love and support. The betrayal felt intentional because of the timing and the way they approached it. They waited exactly 3 months, long enough for the initial shock of Michael's death to settle, but not long enough for me to fully heal. It felt calculated, like they had been planning this conversation, waiting for what they considered the right moment to bring up the money. The fact that they had never once asked how I was coping, never offered any support or comfort, but then felt comfortable asking for financial benefit, suggested a level of selfishness that went beyond simple misunderstanding. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew it would hurt me, but their desire for a European vacation outweighed any concern for my feelings. But then, there were moments when I wondered if I was being too harsh, if maybe they genuinely didn't understand the magnitude of what they were asking. Maybe in their minds, they thought they were helping by suggesting ways to move forward and make good use of the money. Maybe they had convinced themselves that their family vacation idea was actually a thoughtful way to honor Michael's memory and bring healing to our fractured family. I found myself making excuses for them the way I had during Michael's illness, trying to find innocent explanations for behavior that seemed increasingly inexcusable. It's amazing how we can twist ourselves into knots, trying to preserve our faith in people we love, even when all evidence points to the fact that they don't deserve that faith. The internal conflict was eating me alive, because accepting that this was deliberate betrayal meant accepting that my parents were capable of looking at their grieving daughter and seeing only opportunity. It meant acknowledging that the people who were supposed to protect me and support me were actually willing to exploit my pain for their own benefit. But refusing to see it as betrayal meant continuing to make excuses for inexcusable behavior, continuing to protect people who clearly had no intention of protecting me. I was about to learn that this internal struggle was just the beginning, and that their request for Michael's trust fund was only the first step in a pattern of behavior that would force me to make some of the hardest decisions of my life. Sometimes the truth about people we love is so painful that we'll do anything to avoid seeing it clearly, but reality has a way of forcing our eyes open, whether we're ready or not. The more I thought about my parents' request, the more I realized that this wasn't just about protecting Michael's trust fund. This was about fighting for what was right in a world that suddenly felt completely upside down. Every fiber of my being was screaming that something needed to be done, that I couldn't just let this slide and pretend everything was normal. The injustice of their behavior felt like a weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think about anything else. I found myself lying awake at night, planning conversations I would never have, imagining confrontations that would never bring back my son or repair our broken family. But the need for some kind of justice, some kind of accountability, was consuming me from the inside out. Justice in this situation wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about standing up for Michael's memory and refusing to let his death become a financial opportunity for people who had failed him in life. I kept thinking about my grandmother, how hard she had worked to save that money, how excited she had been talking about Michael's future and all the possibilities that money could provide for him. Allowing my parents to use that money for a vacation would be betraying not just Michael, but also the woman who had sacrificed so much to ensure his future was secure. The trust fund wasn't just money, it was love in its purest form, and letting them treat it like a windfall would be disrespecting everything it represented. But fighting for justice when you're already drowning in grief is exhausting in ways I never could have imagined. Every conversation with lawyers, every document I had to review, every decision I had to make about the trust fund felt like I was fighting a battle while simultaneously trying to survive the worst loss of my life. David was supportive, but he was dealing with his own grief and couldn't carry the full weight of this legal and emotional battle. I felt like I was fighting alone against people who should have been fighting alongside me, protecting what remained of Michael's legacy instead of trying to profit from his absence. The energy required to stand up to my parents was energy I didn't have to spare, but I knew that giving in would haunt me forever. The legal system, thankfully, was on my side when it came to protecting the trust fund. My grandmother had been very specific in her will about the money being for Michael's education and future, and since he was gone, the money would remain in trust until specific conditions were met. Conditions that definitely didn't include funding my parents' European vacation. But legal protection didn't address the deeper issue of what kind of people my parents had revealed themselves to be, and what kind of relationship we could possibly have moving forward. Winning the legal battle felt hollow when the real loss was discovering that the people I had trusted most in the world were capable of such calculated cruelty during my darkest hour. The fight for justice became about more than just money. It became about setting boundaries and refusing to let grief make me vulnerable to further exploitation. I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself and Michael's memory now, my parents would continue to see my pain as weakness and my loss as their opportunity. The need to do something, to fight back, to protect what little I had left of my son's legacy, was what eventually gave me the strength to start rebuilding my life. But this was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward understanding what family really means, and learning to distinguish between the people who deserve our loyalty and the people who simply demand it because of shared DNA. Sometimes fighting for justice is less about winning and more about refusing to let injustice define the rest of your story. In the weeks following my parents' shocking request, I found myself facing an impossible choice that would define the rest of my life. Should I try to forgive Robert and Linda for their heartless behavior, or should I cut them out of my life completely? The question haunted me because both options felt like losing something important, either my integrity and self-respect, or the last connection to the family I had grown up believing loved me. Forgiveness felt like letting them off the hook, like telling them their behavior was acceptable when it clearly wasn't. But cutting them off felt like admitting that family bonds could be broken so easily, that the love I thought we shared had never really existed at all. I was caught between my desire to be the bigger person and my need to protect myself from further harm. David was firmly in the cut them off camp. And honestly, his anger on my behalf was one of the few things that made me feel supported during this time. He would say things like, "Sophia, these people missed their grandson's funeral," and then asked for his money. "What more evidence do you need that they don't deserve a place in your life?" But I kept thinking about all the years before Michael's illness, all the family dinners and holiday celebrations, all the times they had seemed like normal, loving grandparents. Was I supposed to just erase decades of history because of their behavior during the worst year of my life? Or was their behavior during the worst year of my life actually the truest reflection of who they really were when the facade was stripped away? The idea of forgiveness kept coming up in my mind, but not because I felt ready or willing to forgive them. It was more like I felt pressure to forgive them, like that's what a good person would do, what a strong person would do. Society tells us that forgiveness is healing, that holding on to anger only hurts ourselves, that family is forever, and we should try to work things out. But every time I imagined calling my parents and telling them I forgave them, I felt sick to my stomach. It felt like betraying Michael, like betraying myself, like telling them that their behavior had no real consequences. How could I forgive people who had shown no remorse, no understanding of what they had done, no desire to make things right? On the other hand, completely cutting them off felt like such a final, irreversible decision that terrified me. What if they eventually came to their senses and apologized? What if I was throwing away the possibility of reconciliation because I was too hurt and angry to see the bigger picture? What if years from now, I would regret not giving them another chance to be the parents I needed them to be? The fear of making the wrong choice was paralyzing, because both forgiveness and estrangement felt like they would change me as a person in ways I wasn't sure I was ready for. I was already dealing with the trauma of losing Michael. Did I really want to add the trauma of losing my parents too? But as I wrestled with this impossible decision, I began to realize that I was asking the wrong question entirely. The choice wasn't really between forgiving them or cutting them off. The choice was between continuing to let their actions define my emotional state, or taking back control of my own life. Whether I forgave them or not, whether I maintained a relationship with them or not, the real question was how I was going to move forward without letting their betrayal poison the rest of my life. The answer to that question would require me to look deeper into myself than I ever had before, and to find strength in places I never knew existed. Sometimes the path to healing doesn't involve the people who hurt us at all. Sometimes it starts with the person we see in the mirror every morning. The moment of breakthrough came on a quiet Thursday morning about 4 months after Michael's death, as I was sitting in his room surrounded by his toys and clothes, trying to decide what to do with his belongings. I had been avoiding this task for weeks, but something about that morning felt different, like I was finally ready to face the physical reminders of his absence. As I held his favorite Lego spaceship, the one he had been building in the hospital during his last weeks, I realized that Michael's memory and legacy didn't depend on my parents' approval or recognition. His love, his impact on my life, his beautiful spirit, none of that could be diminished by their selfishness or their absence from his funeral. The power to honor him, to carry his memory forward, to find meaning in his short but precious life, was entirely within me. If you're going through your own journey of healing after betrayal or loss, please subscribe and give this video a like. Your support means the world to me and helps me share these stories that might help others. Have you ever had a moment where you realized that your healing had to come from within, regardless of whether the people who hurt you ever changed? That's exactly what happened to me that morning in Michael's room. And it was the beginning of everything changing. I want to share this part of my story because I know there are people watching who are waiting for others to apologize, to change, to make things right, when the truth is that our healing can't depend on other people's choices. We have to find our strength from within, even when it feels impossible. That morning, I made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of my grief and recovery. I decided that my parents' behavior said everything about them, and nothing about Michael's worth, nothing about my worth as a mother, and nothing about the love that had defined our family of 3. I realized that waiting for them to understand what they had done, waiting for them to apologize, waiting for them to become the parents and grandparents I needed them to be, was giving them power over my healing that they didn't deserve. My recovery, my ability to find joy again, my capacity to create meaning from this tragedy, all of that had to come from me, not from them. I started to understand that the people who abandon you during your darkest moments are telling you exactly who they are, and believing them is actually a gift to yourself. My parents had shown me that their love was conditional, that their support was unreliable, that their priorities were fundamentally different from mine. Instead of fighting against that reality or trying to change it, I could accept it and build my life accordingly. This didn't mean I wasn't hurt by their behavior, but it meant I could stop expecting different behavior and start focusing on the people who had actually shown up for me during this terrible time. The nurses who cried with me when Michael died, the neighbors who brought meals for weeks, David's family who treated Michael like their own grandchild. These were the people whose love was real and reliable. The shift in my thinking was subtle but profound. Instead of asking, "How could my parents do this to me?" I started asking, "How can I build a life that honors Michael's memory, regardless of what my parents do or don't do?" Instead of focusing on what I had lost in terms of family support, I started focusing on what I still had. Memories of Michael that no one could take away. A husband who loved us both fiercely. Friends who had proven their loyalty through actions rather than words. The realization that my healing had to start with me, and could start with me regardless of anyone else's choices, was terrifying and liberating at the same time. But it was also the foundation that would allow me to rebuild my life in a way that actually reflected my values instead of being defined by other people's failures. One of the hardest realizations I had to face during this journey was examining my own expectations about what family should mean, and how those expectations had been shaped by movies, books, and society's idealized version of family relationships. I had grown up believing that family members were supposed to be there for each other no matter what, that blood relations created unbreakable bonds, that parents would always put their children first, and that grandparents would naturally cherish their grandchildren above everything else. These weren't just hopes or wishes. They were fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. Assumptions that had never been seriously challenged until Michael's illness and death forced me to see my parents' true priorities. The gap between expectation and reality was so vast that it felt like discovering that gravity didn't work the way I thought it did. The cultural narrative around family is so strong that we're taught to make excuses for family members' bad behavior in ways we would never tolerate from friends or acquaintances. We say things like, "Family is family," and "blood is thicker than water," as if genetic relationships automatically create moral obligations and emotional bonds. But my experience with my parents taught me that DNA doesn't guarantee love, support, or basic human decency. The people who share your genetics aren't automatically entitled to your loyalty, your forgiveness, or your emotional energy, especially when they've proven through their actions that they don't value the relationship as much as you do. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop expecting people to be different than they've shown you they are. I started to realize that my expectations had been limiting me in ways I never understood before. By expecting my parents to behave like loving, supportive family members, I had been setting myself up for disappointment over and over again. Every time they failed to show up, literally or emotionally, I felt shocked and hurt, instead of simply noting that they were being consistent with their established pattern of behavior. Once I let go of the expectation that they would somehow transform into the parents I needed them to be, I could see their actions more clearly and make decisions based on reality rather than hope. This shift was incredibly painful, but it was also incredibly freeing. The process of redefining what family meant to me opened up space for much deeper, more authentic relationships with the people who had actually proven their love through actions. David's sister Emma had been more of a grandmother to Michael than my own mother ever was. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had shown more concern for our family during Michael's illness than my father had. My college friend Jennifer had called me every week after Michael's death to check on me, while my own parents had maintained complete silence. These people hadn't been born into our family, but they had chosen to love us, support us, and show up for us when it mattered most. Their love was based on choice rather than obligation, which made it feel more genuine and reliable than the conditional love my parents had offered. Understanding that I had the power to choose my own definition of family was revolutionary, but it also came with responsibility. If I was going to reject the traditional idea that family members deserve automatic loyalty regardless of their behavior, then I also had to take responsibility for actively choosing and nurturing the relationships that did deserve my energy and commitment. I couldn't just complain about my parents' failures. I had to actively build the kind of family and support system that would sustain me through future challenges. This realization would lead me to discover strength and love in places I had never thought to look, and to understand that sometimes losing the family you were born into is actually the first step toward finding the family you were meant to have. About 6 months after Michael's death, I was having one of my worst days, the kind of day where getting out of bed felt impossible, and everything reminded me of what I had lost. I was at the grocery store, trying to buy basic necessities while avoiding the cereal aisle where Michael's favorite brands were displayed, when I ran into Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman whose grandson had been in Michael's class at school. I barely knew her. We had only exchanged polite hellos at school events. But when she saw me that day, she immediately walked over with tears in her eyes. She told me that her grandson Tommy still talked about Michael every day, that Michael had been the only kid who was kind to him when he was being bullied, and that Tommy had been drawing pictures of spaceships and leaving them on Michael's desk at school even after he was gone. What happened next completely caught me off guard and showed me that strength and love can come from the most unexpected places. Mrs. Chen didn't just offer condolences and move on with her shopping. She asked if she could give me a hug, and then she stood there in the middle of the grocery store and let me cry on her shoulder for what felt like 10 minutes. She didn't try to fix anything or offer empty platitudes. She just held me while I fell apart in public, whispering that Michael was a special boy who had made a real difference in her grandson's life. When I finally composed myself enough to speak, she invited me to have tea with her that weekend, saying that she thought we might help each other through our different kinds of grief. Hers for the difficulty of watching her grandson struggle with losing his friend, mine for the devastating loss of Michael himself. That tea date with Mrs. Chen became the first of many, and through her I met other mothers and grandmothers who had experienced various kinds of loss and were finding ways to support each other through shared understanding and genuine compassion. These women, some dealing with divorce, some with elderly parents, some with their own health scares, created an informal support network that became more reliable and nurturing than anything my birth family had ever provided. We would meet at each other's houses, share stories about our children and grandchildren, cook meals together, and celebrate small victories and milestones that our official families often overlooked or minimized. They showed me that family could be created through choice and sustained through consistent acts of love and support. The most unexpected source of strength came from Tommy, Mrs. Chen's grandson, who was only 9 years old, but seemed to understand grief in ways that many adults couldn't. He would draw pictures for me, not just of spaceships like Michael loved, but of all of us together in some imaginary place where lost friends could still play together. When I thanked him for thinking of Michael, he said something that stopped me in my tracks. My grandma says that when someone we love dies, we have to love them extra hard so they can still feel it wherever they are. This 9-year-old child had found a way to understand and cope with loss that was more mature and comforting than anything any adult had offered me, including trained grief counselors and therapists. Through these unexpected connections, I learned that strength doesn't always come from the places we expect it to come from, and that sometimes losing the support we thought we could count on opens us up to receiving support from sources we never would have discovered otherwise. If my parents had been present and supportive during my grief, I might never have been open to the deep friendships and chosen family relationships that ultimately proved to be more sustaining and authentic than the biological relationships I had been trying so hard to preserve. The people who showed up for me during my darkest time weren't obligated to care about me or Michael, which made their caring feel like a gift, rather than an expectation. Their love was freely given and consistently demonstrated, which taught me what genuine family relationships should actually look like, and gave me a new standard for what I would accept in all my relationships going forward. As I continued building these unexpected relationships and finding strength in places I never thought to look, I realized that Michael's death, as devastating as it was, had also given me an opportunity to completely rebuild my life according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. The Sophia who existed before losing Michael had been someone who constantly sought approval from her parents, who made excuses for other people's bad behavior, who prioritized keeping peace over standing up for what was right. But the Sophia who emerged from that grief was someone who had learned the difference between people who claim to love you and people who actually show love through their actions. This transformation wasn't something I chose. It was something that was forced upon me by circumstances, but I did choose how to respond to it. If you're on your own journey of rebuilding after loss or betrayal, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Sharing these stories helps me and helps others who are walking similar paths know they're not alone. Have you ever found yourself becoming a stronger person through surviving something you never thought you could survive? Because that's exactly what happened to me, and I want you to know that transformation is possible even in the darkest circumstances. The person you become after surviving your worst nightmare might be completely different from who you were before, but that doesn't mean the change is bad. Sometimes it means you finally become who you were always meant to be. I'm sharing this part of my story because I know there are people watching who are in the middle of their own transformation and might not recognize their own strength yet. The process of creating my own future meant letting go of the life I had planned and embracing the life that was actually possible. Before Michael got sick, I had this clear picture of what our family would look like. Holiday gatherings with grandparents who adored him, family vacations where 3 generations would make memories together, graduations and weddings where Michael would be surrounded by extended family who had watched him grow up. Cancer took away that future, but my parents' behavior after his death took away the fantasy that any of it had ever been real in the first place. Once I stopped mourning the loss of a family dynamic that had never actually existed, I could start building something genuine and sustainable with the people who had proven their love through actions rather than words. Creating my own future also meant taking control of Michael's legacy in ways that honored who he actually was, rather than trying to please people who had never really known him. I started a small scholarship fund at his elementary school for children who showed kindness to their classmates, because that's what Michael had been known for. Not his academic achievements or his potential, but his huge heart and his natural compassion for other kids who were struggling. I used some of my own savings, rather than touching his trust fund, which remained protected according to my grandmother's wishes, and I involved David, Mrs. Chen, Tommy, and the network of people who had actually loved Michael, rather than trying to include my parents, who had forfeited their right to participate in decisions about his memory. The transformation from victim to creator of my own destiny wasn't linear or easy, and there were plenty of days when I felt like I was taking 2 steps backward for every step forward. But each small decision to choose authentic relationships over convenient ones, each choice to protect my energy rather than waste it on people who had proven themselves unworthy of it, each moment when I honored Michael's memory in ways that reflected his actual character rather than other people's expectations. All of these choices gradually built a life that felt true to who I had become through surviving this loss. The future I was creating looked nothing like the future I had planned, but it was mine in a way that the old future never could have been, because it was built on truth rather than hope, and on proven love rather than assumed obligations. Looking back now, more than a year after Michael's death and my parents' betrayal, I can see that the darkest period of my life was also the period that taught me the most important lessons about love, family, strength, and what really matters when everything else is stripped away. Losing Michael broke my heart in ways that will never fully heal, but discovering my parents' true character during that loss actually freed me from relationships that had been limiting and damaging me for years, without me realizing it. The pain of both losses was overwhelming at the time, but surviving them showed me that I was capable of much more strength, resilience, and wisdom than I had ever given myself credit for. Sometimes it takes losing everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need. The people who are in my life now, David, Mrs. Chen, and Tommy, the mothers in our informal support group, the teachers and nurses who still reach out to check on me. These relationships are deeper and more genuine than the family relationships I spent decades trying to preserve through compromise and excuse-making. When someone chooses to love you and support you without obligation or expectation of benefit, that love has a quality that can't be replicated by relationships based on duty or tradition. Michael's death taught me to recognize the difference between people who are present during the good times and people who show up during the worst times, and that distinction has become one of my most important criteria for deciding who deserves space in my life. I still think about my parents sometimes, and I still feel sad about what we lost, but I no longer feel guilty about protecting myself from their destructive behavior. They made their choices: to skip Michael's funeral, to prioritize their own comfort during his illness, to see his death as a financial opportunity rather than a devastating loss. And I made mine, which was to stop accepting treatment that didn't reflect my worth or Michael's memory. Setting those boundaries wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about creating space for relationships that could actually sustain me through future challenges and celebrations. The energy I used to spend managing their disappointment and making excuses for their failures is now available for nurturing the relationships that actually add value to my life. Michael's trust fund remains untouched, exactly as my grandmother intended, waiting for a purpose that honors both of their legacies in a meaningful way. I've been working with a lawyer to establish guidelines for how the money might eventually be used, perhaps for a scholarship program, perhaps for supporting other families dealing with childhood cancer, perhaps for something I haven't thought of yet, but that would make both Michael and my grandmother proud. The decision will be made by people who actually loved Michael and understood what he represented, not by people who saw his death as an opportunity for their own benefit. This feels like justice, not because it punishes my parents, but because it protects the integrity of love and sacrifice that money represents. The most important thing I've learned through this entire experience is that you can't control what other people do, but you can control how you respond to what they do, and those responses determine the quality and direction of your entire life. My parents' betrayal during my worst moment revealed their character, but my decision to protect myself from further harm and to build authentic relationships with people who had proven their love revealed mine. I'm not the same person I was before losing Michael, and I'm not the same person I was when I was still trying to maintain a relationship with parents who had shown me their true priorities. The person I've become through surviving the worst thing I could imagine is someone I actually respect and admire, someone who knows the difference between real love and performed love, someone who won't sacrifice her own well-being to maintain relationships that don't serve her or honor the memory of the child she lost. As I finish sharing this deeply personal story with you, I want to ask you something that I hope will stay with you long after this video ends. If you were in my position, if the people who were supposed to love and support you most had abandoned you during your darkest hour and then tried to profit from your pain, what would you have done? Would you have forgiven them and tried to rebuild those relationships? Or would you have chosen to protect yourself and create new family bonds with people who had proven their love through actions? I'm genuinely curious about your perspective, because I know that everyone's journey through betrayal and loss is different, and there's no single right answer to these impossible situations. Your thoughts and experiences in the comments could help other viewers who are facing similar challenges. If you've made it this far in my story, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button, not just to support me, but to support the community of people who are sharing their own stories of survival, transformation, and finding strength in unexpected places. Have you ever had to redefine what family means to you after being let down by the people you trusted most? Because that's a journey that so many of us are walking, often feeling alone and wondering if we're making the right choices. When you subscribe and engage with these stories, you're helping create a space where people can be honest about the messy, complicated reality of family relationships, instead of pretending everything is perfect when it's not. The question I want to leave you with today is this: do you believe that forgiveness always leads to healing? Or are there some betrayals that require us to choose our own well-being over reconciliation? In my case, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop expecting people to be different than they've repeatedly shown you they are. But I also learned that healing doesn't require forgiveness from the people who hurt us. Sometimes it requires us to forgive ourselves for staying in harmful relationships longer than we should have, and to trust our own judgment about who deserves access to our hearts and our energy. I know that some of you watching this are probably dealing with your own family drama, your own moments of betrayal, your own grief that's been complicated by other people's selfishness or absence. I want you to know that your feelings are valid, that protecting yourself from further harm isn't cruel or selfish, and that sometimes the family you choose becomes more important than the family you were born into. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, and you don't have to sacrifice your peace of mind to maintain relationships that consistently bring you pain. Trust your instincts about who deserves your energy and your love. In my next video, I'm going to talk about the specific steps I took to rebuild my life after cutting ties with toxic family members, including how I learned to trust new people after being betrayed by the people I trusted most. I'll share the mistakes I made along the way, the moments when I doubted my decisions, and the signs that helped me recognize genuine love and support when I found it again. If you want to hear that part of the story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because I think it might help anyone who's trying to figure out how to move forward after their world has been turned upside down. Thank you for listening to my story, for being part of this community, and for reminding me that sharing our truth, even when it's painful, can help others feel less alone in their own struggles.